Welcome back, everyone, to the State of the Nation. Now, one of the biggest accusations by the opposition and many and now in the private sector is that the government's continuation to listen to one-note organizations like the IMF, whose clear goal is to implement measures that takes care of their creditors and not so much the people whose country's economy that has gone amiss. Even recently, the government is set to end tax breaks for Port City Colombo projects being implemented by a Chinese state-run firm as part of commitments under the IMF bailout package, a move expected to hit the viability of a $1.4 billion venture. So do what the IMF says, if not, they'll destroy everything, is basically the wording from that end. But if you do as they tell you, then they'll sing praises of us, saying the economy is doing well and everything is making progress better than expected. But cross them and find out everything is going to go completely haywire. However, on the ground, you and me, the common man, is yet to feel any relief on that front. Fuel prices still remain high despite promises of bringing them down after slashing taxes. Electricity prices obviously got a bump. A newly introduced digital tax is in place, property tax, talk about many new taxes. And all of them are in full swing, as if we still are living in the times of the Yahapalne government. So IMF indicators are showing that our nation's economy is doing well. To whom is it doing well? Is it to the selected few or to the masses at large? Let's get some perspective on this matter, and joining me now is the Associate Professor of Economics from Denison University in the United States, Professor Fadhel Kaboub, who's currently, I think he's in Germany. He's also the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and also the author of a very interesting article regarding how the Global South nations that are in debt can come together to solve the issue posed by Western nations. Professor, an honor indeed to speak to you tonight. Thank you very much for being here. Now, first, let me ask, in a recent podcast, I believe you said that organizations like the IMF has no interest in making a country's economy healthy, and more importantly, does not care about it at all. Can you please explain as to why you think that?
Well, thank you, Mahesh, for the question and for the kind invitation. So when you think of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, both institutions created during colonial times, when most of the Global South was still colonies to the British Empire, the French Empire, and so on. These are organizations that were created for colonial purposes within a framework of a colonial economic architecture. And to be very clear, colonial economic architecture was not designed for development. It was not designed for the sustainable development goals. It was not designed for human rights or even for democracy. Colonial architecture was hierarchical, abusive, extractive, non-democratic. So when you look at the track record of the IMF, for example, with many countries in the Global South, my country included, your country included, you realize that many of our countries have been essentially following the prescription, the economic policy prescription of the IMF for decades. Micromanagement of IMF conditionalities has been dictated for decades. And you realize that if a country, after decades of following these prescriptions, is still stuck in a debt trap, it has to mean one of two things. It's either that the IMF is simply incompetent and is unable to deliver development and change and economic transformation, or it's intentional economic entrapment. It can't be anything else. Either way, it means the failure of the IMF to deliver economic transformation for countries in the Global South means that we have to reject the economic policy framework, whether it's intentional entrapment or incompetence. It means you have to think about a different model of economic development that is different from what the IMF has been dictating. And to be very clear, the economic architecture that was designed during colonial times, as I described earlier, was designed to impose a particular role on the global South. And it can be summarized in three basic points. Number one, the global South was supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that function to this day. Number two, the global South is supposed to be the consumer of industrial output and technologies from the global North. And we still play that function to this day. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development and cooperation and job creation. But effectively, what it does is that permanently locks us at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the global value chain. And we still play that function to this day, which means the colonial economic role that was imposed on the global South is still persistent to this day. And the IMF and the World Bank, as major global financial institutions, were never able to undo that colonial economic role that was imposed on us. If anything, they were able to perpetuate exactly the same colonial functions that were imposed on us. And that's what makes them purely colonial institutions to this day.
That's indeed an interesting topic for sure. Finally, Professor, if in Sri Lanka's case, how can we as a nation, in your opinion, what must we do to get out of this debt crisis we have at hand, and what would be our best way forward towards economic independence and prosperity?
As I mentioned earlier, it's very hard for one country at a time in the global South to face all of these major challenges by itself. So when I think of South-South cooperation and solidarity, I think of it as an economic and geopolitical survival strategy, which means regional cooperation with countries that are precisely in the same debt trap, precisely with the same structural deficiencies on the food front, on the energy front, on the manufacturing front, to convene high-level dialogues, meaning not just at the ministerial level, but at the presidential level, to have serious conversations about how can we use the complementarity of our resources and capabilities, our large internal market as regional blocks, in order to strategically undo the root causes of external borrowing, which starts with food deficits, food imports, which starts with energy deficits, and which start with manufacturing deficiencies, the fact that our industrial base has been locked at the bottom of the value chain, and which allow regional blocs to use their collective economic weight and collective geopolitical weight to negotiate better terms in terms of transfer of technology, in terms of joint ventures with countries that have the technological capabilities to share in kind in order to create win-win scenarios for the economies of the global South. And that is really the prerequisite for economic transformation. But if countries try to go it alone, I'm afraid that all of these policies will fail because you don't have the economic prerequisites as small nations to undo the economic architecture that was imposed on the global South that continues to be enforced, whether it's the global financial architecture, whether it's the rules of international trade and investment, meaning the WTO rules, or whether it's the rules of international taxation, which for the longest time was in the hands of the OECD, but now thanks to the recent UN vote from a year and a half ago, now we're finally decolonizing international taxation and putting it in the UN system with one country, one vote. So there's hope for progress in terms of undoing the economic architecture of the colonial era, but there is much more work that needs to be done, and no country alone can undo that architecture. It has to be massive South-South cooperation to undo these structural traps.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Kaboub, it's been an honor speaking to you, and I hope to talk to you soon with a bit of bit in length on your proposals, how Sri Lanka can actually come out of this crisis that we actually have made it by ourselves. Sincere appreciation and gratitude for your time. Thank you very much. Let's take a short commercial break.